Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Andy Agathan. Today we'll get things underway in just a short while. I'm extremely pleased with a number of things, particularly the tremendous turnout we've had today. So thank you all very much indeed for setting aside some time to be with us this afternoon. Okay, we're going to use a slide deck. There's quite a bit in it. We have a tremendous amount of content to work our way through. We are recording the session, which means that we'll be putting up on social media in probably 2 or 3 days' time. Can I please ask that when we do and when you get notified about that, please do all you can to share awareness of it, because we don't have anything in the way of a advertising budget or marketing budget. Everything we do in terms of promotion is based upon goodwill within the community. That means people like yourselves taking the time and trouble to press a few buttons on social media and get the word out there by sharing and reposting and retweeting and that kind of thing. Okay, so we're going to get straight underway. There will be ample time for Q&A later, but between now and then there's quite a bit to get through, so I'm going to be doing that as of just a few seconds time. There we go. The chat is open. Feel free to put comments and questions into the chat. Of course, however angry or animated you feel about things, remain polite and civilized. The Transparency Task Force is building a very good reputation, I think, of being very potent, but also very polite. Everything we do is evidence-based, and I'll be touching on that point on many occasions during the course of today's session. So here we go. Faces of financial crime, suffering caused by the financial sector. We have an agenda, which I'll come to in a moment. The first thing I really want to draw your attention to is a few comments about the visuals used in the publication. And don't worry if you haven't yet seen it, because I'll shortly be giving you a link to the paper in the chat. Most of the links at the beginning of the paper are all about individuals who are suffering distress as a consequence of the harm that they experienced. Every one of those images could tell a particular story, including, for example, the lady in the ambulance who's been rushed to hospital because she's had some kind of a heart attack because of the stress and suffering that she has caused. I promise you this, folks, every one of the pictures that we've chosen in the paper relates to at least one real story of one real human being that we've become aware of since the Transparency Task Force started our crusade for change way back in 2015. Every one of them relates to at least one individual. The second image you see is the back cover. I want to spend a few moments talking about the images on the back cover. On the back cover, you see there's a few people that you would obviously associate with being criminals of some kind. These are the people who are wearing a mask or wearing a balaclava. They're very deliberately been chosen to represent, the bad people, the criminals, the crooksters, the shysters, the people who've been stealing money. In a way, they're not the real problem, because crooks are crooks, and they're always crooks. The real problem are the people who are crooks who don't look like they're crooks. The gentleman at the top with his little iPad presenter, he's somebody in the process of selling somebody something that they're going to end up regretting buying. He's a very well-dressed, smart, credible-looking person, exactly the kind of appearance that so many people have fallen foul of. These are the crooks that don't look like crooks. Further down, you'll see a very pleasant-looking young lady facing a gentleman who's got his back towards us. You'll see, if you're sharp-eyed, you'll see in the background there's some reference to a loan arrangement. We've chosen that image because she represents a bank worker who's in the process of selling some kind of interest rate hedging product to supposedly protect the downside of interest rate fluctuations in a loan. She looks perfectly innocent. And you know what's really sad? She, as an individual, may be completely unaware that she's actually perpetrating what will turn out to be something very fraudulent and very crooked. Thousands of business owners around the UK ended up buying, because they were missold them, toxic, fraudulently sold interest rate hedging products. And what about all those people in that glorious looking boardroom with all that glass and the sunset? You know, they look so credible. That picture was chosen because it represents the boardroom of a bank, the kind of household name bank that we all know about. These are the very boardrooms where decisions were made that resulted in catastrophic failure of the regulatory system and the global financial system back in 2008. These also represent the images of the bank boardrooms where decisions were made about things like interest rate hedging products, etc. So really the first message, ladies and gentlemen, is I want you to kind of frame in your own minds what a scammer looks like. It could be a crook with a balaclava type narrative. It could equally be somebody who is a very well-dressed gentleman or lady in a very respectable, inverted commas, major financial institution with hundreds of years of history and pedigree to its name. But in reality, one is as crooked as the other. I'm going to put into the chat now the link to the document, just in case you haven't yet seen it. So we're very, very proud of this piece of work. I'm sure that message is going to come across loud and clear. It really is something that we have good reason to be proud of. Here it is in its physical form. You'll see it's quite, there's a lot in it. There really is a lot in it. There's 100 and something of pages. How many pages are there? There's 124 or 25 pages. It's packed full of insights and experiences. We've spent a lot of time and effort on it on a purely voluntary basis. And there are a lot of people to thank, of course, including the people who've stepped forward to tell us about the experiences that they've had. So that's the first point. Reframe what a crook looks like, people, because it could look like a very well-dressed gentleman or lady in a household name organisation. I'm going to rush through the first couple of bullet points because that's about the TTF. Many, if not most of you, know about the Transparency Task Force already. There are some very special thank yous that I'm going to be so proud to say. We'll talk about some statements of support. We're then going to hear from Robert Lynham. Robert's going to be speaking on his behalf and also Kerry Clark's behalf. Kerry can't be with us today. Robert and Kerry are, in so many ways, the reasons why this publication became possible. If it wasn't for Robert and Kerry, this could not be happening today because we couldn't have written the report, because we didn't have the people to do the research. Everything we do is evidence-based, everything we do is built on research, and it was Robert and Kerry who undertook the important research that made this document possible. I'll then refer to a few more statements of support. By the way, there's a task I want you to all embrace wholeheartedly. If you haven't yet given us a statement of support, please, you must do that. You must do that, because we're going to be keeping the publication up to date with all the statements of support that we get. And if you're inclined to agree with the general thrust of the paper and the work that we've done, then please, you must make sure you give us a statement of support. However insignificant you might think it is, the quantum of statements of support that we have is being noted by the people in Parliament. Our ability to evidence there is a grassroots support for the kind of reforms we're talking about, the better it is for us making the changes that are so desperately needed. We've then got Mark Bishop. Many of you will know Mark already. I'm going to put Mark on mute. I know he's not actually feeling too great right now. He's had COVID, and that's why Mark was not able to be with us in Parliament last week, but he very kindly recorded his presentation for the event we had in Parliament on Thursday. Mark's here in person today. Those of you that know Mark will know that he is a remarkably informed, insightful, forensically minded person, and you're going to really benefit from understanding Mark's view about the policy recommendations, why they are what they are, and frankly, what needs to happen to get the FCA to become fit for purpose. Subtext, it definitely isn't fit for purpose right now. Some more statements of support, then there'll be a bit of discussion, and then the last few minutes will just be me leaving you all with a few thoughts about how we approach things moving forward. So that's the agenda. Moving on, the TTF, I really am going to fly through this. We are a certified social enterprise, which means we exist to make an impact, not to make a profit. We're fast growing, very, very fast growing. We're growing at roughly 20% a year. There are very few organizations that have been able to grow 20% a year over the last 5, 6, 7 years or so. We already have approximately 300 ambassadors around the world in 22 countries. And as of 5:35, I think it was, on Thursday morning, we had 5,902 people within our community who get our comms, etc., etc. We're evidence-based. I think that's the third time I've mentioned that point. I'll be mentioning it several times more. It's such an important point to make. It's such an important point to make, folks, because we are going to be making some profoundly potent points today, some really hard-hitting points. Here's one, for example. It is absolutely clear to me that the FCA is not fit for purpose. You know, the statements don't get much more profoundly positive and potent than that. And it's important that you understand that these comments we're making are not based upon, you know, vague feelings or conspiracy theory. They are based upon hard, provable evidence that we've been able to see over the last 6.5 years, 7 years or so. Our mission, as you can see, is to promote ongoing reform of the financial sector so that it serves society better. And the question, what do we actually do? Well, as those of you who know us will know, we do loads. We publish the Transparency Times, we run events, we respond to consultations. I'm pretty sure when I say that I'm right in indicating we run more consultation responses than any other financial services reform organisation in the UK. We're very collaborative. We run Project Parliament, which is all about bringing similar organisations together. We campaign in the media. I've been on TV a couple of times. There was a special Radio 4 programme called the Transparency Detectives, in the press all the time, etc., etc., etc. We carry out research. We engage with parliamentarians. We produce discussion papers, such as the one we're producing today. We published a book. I'll quickly show you our book. Our book is called Why We Must Rebuild Trustworthiness and Confidence in the Financial Services Sector and How We Can Do It. There it is in hardback form. I'm very, very proud of that book. 55 of our members around the world worked collaboratively with me to write that book. We're very proud of that too. In addition, we run the Rally for Better Financial Regulation. We ran it for the first time in London in May. It's going to become an annual event for the UK, and we have aspirations of it becoming an event in other countries too. We also run the advisory group for Violation Tracker UK. There's some harder data in our paper from Violation Tracker UK. If you don't already know it, please do check out Violation Tracker UK. We will be circulating the slides. The links at the bottom of the slides, for example, the one you can see here, will all become workable if you view the slides in presenter mode. And we also provide the secretariat to the all-party parliamentary group on personal banking and fairer financial services. Now, this is an extremely important development, particularly because the APPG is running this call for evidence, a call for evidence about the FCA. It's been up and running for about a year, a remarkably successful venture. We've had over 160 written submissions from various people, including former and current employees of the FCA itself. And you must look at the evidence we provided online through the APPG's website, where you can read testimony from people and you can also watch video interviews from people talking about the FCA. Conclusion, there really is a mountain of damning evidence about the Financial Conduct Authority that's now getting out into the open, and that's a very, very important point to make. Everything we do, absolutely everything we do, comes under the umbrella of what we call our strategy for driving change. Very simply, that's to bring together the thinking of two groups of people. On the one hand, those that we characterize as having the passion and purpose for the change that is needed, and on the other hand, those with the power and the position to make change possible. Those are the parliamentarians, the policymakers, the bureaucrats, the civil servants. These are the people that we must liaise with to get the rules of the game of financial services changed for the better. The discussion paper and this meeting are all part of that strategy for driving change. Thank you all very much indeed again for being part of that strategy, even if only for today. Whilst we're in thanking people mode, we really must and want to provide a great big thank you to Mark Bishop, whose input to the Transparency Task Force, not just this paper, but generally speaking, is off the scale. Having Mark with us is like having, you know, a one-man army. He's absolutely first class in terms of his support for the TTF, and provides incredible, valuable guidance and counselling and stewardship to me and others in the TTF. Funding for Social Change Limited provided us with money. We need money. We desperately need money. If it wasn't for the support from Funding for Social Change Limited, we would not have had the money to produce the booklets. We've already sent the booklets to 101 parliamentarians, and there's roughly another 50 or so that have already been given out to people who came to the meeting on Thursday, and the balance will be going to various important folks as time goes by. So we're using them to great effect. The people from Violation Tracking UK, who provided us with the data, Kerry and Robert I've already mentioned. Without them, we could not have done the research. Therefore, we could not have produced the paper. My wonderful team at TTF, particularly Tina, who spent hours and hours and hours producing the artwork and the actual physical publication of the book, etc. But most importantly, and I stress this, most importantly, the 22 completely and utterly innocent victims that stepped forward to share their stories. So before we do anything else, folks, I know we're all, you know, we're distant from each other. Can we please show our appreciation for everybody that's been involved in helping to do the work that's been necessary to actually get this superb piece of work underway. It really is a remarkable team effort from many people. Thank you for showing your support. Okay, we are off the scale delighted with the support we're getting from all kinds of stakeholders, particularly the parliamentarians, because these are the folks who are in a position to really help make a difference. We've got numerous. Here's one from Stephen Timms MP, a remarkably popular parliamentarian. For those of you that don't know, Stephen is the chair of the Work and Pension State Committee, and he's recently been knighted. He's recently become the Right Honourable Sir Stephen Timms MP. He says, and I'm truly flattered by this, I greatly appreciate the work of the Transparency Task Force, in particular in supporting the victims of pension scams who have suffered such devastating losses. TTF drew the plight to the attention of the Select Committee, leading to our inquiry on the subject and our report. There's a link to the report, which was published on 28th of March 2021. Well done, and thank you to Stephen Timms. The next one is from Baroness Finlay of Lambeth. She says, financial fraud is an ever-increasing problem, causing extensive distress to the many victims and destroying their lives. We must all be grateful to those who have had the courage to come forward and describe their experiences, motivated by a desire to help protect others from the trauma they have experienced. The damage to their lives has been extensive and has to date gone in large part unacknowledged by the finance industry. There is now an urgent need to act on the Transparency Task Force reports and eliminate fraudulent actors from the financial marketplace. The next, before I pass over to Robert, is from Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle. But that's Natalie Bennett. She comes to lots of our events, a really lovely lady, former leader of the Green Party. Financial crime and mismanagement is sometimes dismissed as victimless, but of course it is far from that. We all suffer collectively from the fraud and greed, but some people's lives are torn apart by it. We live under the dictatorship of the Treasury, with the assumption being that we are all here to serve the economy rather than the economy serving people and planet. Practical regulation can prevent further individual victimization, but more, we need a huge revamp of our approach to financial governance. Wonderful input from Baroness Natalie Bennett. Robert, please take this opportunity, sir, to share your screen, which you should be able to do at your end. Introduce yourself and off you go to deal with the several slides that you've got. Just while Robert's getting himself ready, can I please invite you to once again show your appreciation to Robert and Kerry, who can't be here because of the work that they've done that resulted in this all being possible. Great job, Robert. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Andy, and good afternoon, everyone. My name's Robert, as Andy said. Myself and Kerry interned with the TTF last July, where we started the research and the the process of writing our contribution to this report. Just briefly a little bit about myself. I'm currently just finishing off my Masters of Social Research at the University of Birmingham, and I've provided my contact details just there on the screen for you. So should you have any questions or questions about the content of the report, then please feel free to get in touch. So Kerry can't be here today, but she's also a student at the University of Birmingham. As you can see, we're both in the College of Social Sciences, so that's our background. Hence why we took an interest when interning with the TTF about doing some work on the human impact of financial crime, given our absence of particularly financial knowledge about the financial services sector. And those are Kerry's details should you also wish to contact her. Kerry's interests are in sociology, conflict, and corruption and power. So you can kind of see the parallels there with the content of the report as well. So very briefly, I'd just like to say a few words about our involvement with the paper. Our internship last July was supposed to be 4 weeks long, where Andy suggests we do some research on the human impact of financial crime, but we ended up extending or carrying on continuing to produce the paper over the summer, and have been continuing to work on it in part throughout the year as well. And it's really exciting to have finished the project now. And it's really very humbling as well, because when we started the internship, we didn't, I suppose, neither of us really thought that we'd be able to contribute to a really meaningful piece of work, which could actually have some chance of, making a meaningful change and reform to the financial services industry, which will then go on to benefit those involved and impacted in the report. So in terms of what we did with the report itself, we very briefly did a small literature review on what's been written about financial crime and the human impact of financial crime. I suppose the main conclusion from that was that there really wasn't a lot outside of fraud and scams. And a lot of the issues raised in this report are more of an institutional basis. So they're problems with the regulation and the banking industry. So I suppose the contribution of the report in that sense is that it raises a lot of different issues which aren't covered in the literature. And given our 4-week proper internship that we had limited time, so we chose to do interviews with people already known to the TTF, as they had really important stories to tell. After conducting the interviews with the 22 different individuals and pairs of individuals that we had, Kerry led the analysis of the common harms caused across those individual cases. So although each of the cases are obviously unique and they tell a story behind a statistic, there are common themes present throughout. And we'd just like to say as well that we made ethics front and center throughout the research, given the sensitivity of some of the content raised in the interviews. So we provided research participants with the chance to withdraw and also to make any edits to any of the content which we wrote in the report as well. So yes, just to reiterate, if you have any questions about what we did, how we did it, then please get in contact with either myself or Kerry. Thank you, Andy.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. I'm sure everybody's going to want to do what we did just now once again, which is to show our appreciation to Rob and Kerry for the work that they've done. Please let's do that. Remember, these guys did what they did on a purely voluntary basis, and put far more time and effort into the internship than they ever would have expected, and we will always be indebted to them. We always will be indebted to them. Well done, Robert. Of course, well done, Kerry. She can't be here, but well done to Kerry too. Okay, we're going to jump back to my slides when I get to them. Where are they? Here they are. Something I want to really stress about Rob and Kerry's work, I was genuinely blown away by the maturity with which they approach the work, particularly, as Robert touched on, the ethics side of it. They really, really wanted to make sure that the victims who stepped forward were treated respectfully and courteously, were not treated in some kind of sausage machine kind of way. They wanted to give everybody time and space, and they wanted to make sure the victims felt empowered. They were in charge of the process, and they really went around that very well. We had some great advice from various people, including Leslie Kerwin. Some of you may know Leslie. She used to present on BBC TV and Radio 4. And I remember Leslie being particularly helpful in relation to the advice and guidance she gave about making sure that we didn't, make the victims feel too upset and so on and so forth. So well done, Leslie Kerwin, too. Here's another statement of support from Sarah Olney. Sarah was with us in Parliament on Thursday. She says, "My primary responsibility is and always will be to do the best job I can to care for the interests of all the constituents of Richmond Park. It therefore follows that any genuine effort to help reduce the chances that my constituents might become a victim of financial crime, fraud, misconduct and scams, and to better support them if they do become a victim, is something I instinctively want to back." I'm going to break out of the quote for a moment because Sarah makes two really good points there. This is really a two-dimensional issue. One part of it is about stopping people from becoming victims of financial crime in the first place. Of course, that's really, really important. But the second dimension is perhaps just as important. It's about providing proper support to people who have sadly become victims. It is heartbreaking how unhelpful the system is, the establishment is, when somebody has become a victim of financial crime. They don't really fit into any particular institutional box. And as a result, the sort of pass from pillar to post, it's bloody awful. It really is. That has to change. Sarah then goes on to say, "I am pleased that the Transparency Task Force has produced this discussion paper, not only because it brings into sharp focus the awful experience that so many victims of financial crime have had to endure, but also because it points towards the very real possibility that us parliamentarians can make a big difference, can make a difference by introducing purposeful reforms in this parliamentary session." I'm going to stress that when you hear Mark Bishop talk, Mark's going to be talking about very specific opportunities in this parliamentary session to add amendments and make changes that could make an enormous difference to the landscape that we're talking about. Sarah goes on to say, "As protecting the public from financial harm is not in any way a party political issue, I hope and expect that other parliamentarians will join me in supporting this excellent initiative." Thank you, Sarah, for such a lovely comment of support. Andrew Gwynn MP. "I'm delighted that the Transparency Task Force has produced this report because the UK's financial sector is of strategic importance to our economy, and it ought to be doing a decent job serving the interests of all our citizens, but it clearly isn't. The report shouts out the terrible impact on victims of financial crime and misconduct and provides extensive evidence suggesting that the financial regulatory framework is not yet effective, code for it's not fit for purpose, in providing adequate consumer protection. The central thrust of the paper is that parliamentarians now have an opportunity to bring about reforms during this parliamentary session that will mitigate the risk of consumers being harmed and also provide meaningful support to those that do become victims. I wholeheartedly agree, and I will be doing my bit to support such reforms wherever and whenever I can. My own constituents are not immune from scams in this setting, and I want to do all I can to help protect the interests. What a great comment. What a lovely, lovely comment from Andrew Gwynn MP. Well done, Andrew. Here's one from Baroness Thornton. Financial crime is not victimless. That's a really important point, folks. Financial crime is not victimless, but often the victims are the most vulnerable and the least able to defend themselves and get redress, which is why providing and enacting an appropriate degree of consumer protection is vital and still lacking, and why this initiative is so important and has my support. Now, the bit in the italics there and the bit in the speech marks, an appropriate degree of consumer protection, that's the formal regulatory lingo for what the Financial Conduct Authority is supposed to be providing an appropriate degree of consumer protection. Isn't that rather woolly, folks? Isn't it clearly obvious that we need a better definition to a big part of the FCA's job spec? It's far too woolly. Last one before we pass on to Mark Bishop. This is from Shane Norman. I'm very proud to say is with us today. Shane's a great supporter of TTF, one of our ambassadors. Shane's comment of support just plays so nicely into the narrative that Mark is going to be talking about in just a moment. Shane says, the FCA website states its aim is to make financial markets work well so that consumers get a fair deal. It claims that it applies 3 approaches to achieving that aim. 1, protecting consumers. 2, enhancing market integrity. And 3, promoting competition. With this damning research, TTF has shown conclusively that the first 2 have become entirely subservient to the third, making the FCA an industry representative body more than a regulator. And it's the last bit that's really powerful, and it's the last bit that Mark's going to be talking to in a moment. Only top to bottom reform of its entire culture can ensure that these shameful cases of condoned fraud, assisted theft and active mendacity can never happen again. That's a really powerful statement of support. Can I please invite you folks to do several things at the same time? Show your appreciation for Mark, who's about to speak, and for all those folk who very kindly gave us a statement of support. Thank you very much indeed. Well done to all those concerned. Well done. Mr. Mark Bishop, over to you, sir. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy. So I'm going to share screen. That's the most important thing. Okay, so I'm going to talk about really how to do something about the mess that we're in. And firstly, maybe just to introduce myself, I appear in this report really in 2 ways. One is as one of the scam victims, as a case study, if you like, and the other one is a financial services campaigner because I wrote the policy section. So just to remind you of why I'm wearing the first of those hats, I invested in the Connaught Income Fund Series 1, which ran between 2008 and 2012, which was a Ponzi-style lending fraud within the regulatory perimeter enabled by Capita Financial Managers, which is now Link Fund Solutions. The FSA and FCA repeatedly failed to act to prevent or terminate fraud. And the question is whether this was merely negligence or something worse than that. Ex post, the regulators consistently sought to cover up its own role in this particular scandal. There was a highly critical, supposedly independent review published in December 2020, but doesn't even touch the sides in terms of the regulatory shortcomings in this particular case. Even now, the regulator is quite honestly lying about the financial plight of the victims, pretending we've had all of our money back, we're not out of pocket at all, in order to avoid claims for compensation. 10 years on also, it's worth stressing there have been no prosecutions, no bans and no fines. And Capita, or Link as it now is, has since enabled at least 3 billion worth of losses to consumers in the Woodford Equity Income Fund. And now talking about how I've evolved really from that position, one of the victims, into a financial services campaigner. Well, it started with me leading an action group for Connaught and chairing the Liquidators Committee. And after a few years of doing that, I'd picked up, I think, some skills that might be relevant. And I was setting out to try and help people who were running other action groups, as well as individuals and victims of scams and regulatory failures. So informally, I was becoming a campaigner, if you like. And since 2014, I've knocked on the door of the FCA every time a new chief executive has been appointed, whether permanent or temporary, offering to help them to work to fix the problems that the Connaught case caused me to identify. Not one of them has agreed to meet with me. A couple have let me meet with direct reports, and they've said, nothing needed, we've not got a problem. More recently, in the last maybe 2.5 years, I've been working with Transparency Task Force, mostly in the area of strategy and public affairs. I'm on the Secretariat of the APPG on personal banking and fair financial services, and have been very closely involved in the call for evidence about the FCA. I'm also on the SME liaison panel of the British Banking Resolution Service, which I would describe as a redress prevention scheme. It's something that looks like it's there to create redress for small business victims, but in reality, it's there to protect the banks from having to pay the people whose businesses they destroyed. So let me talk about the scale of the problem. And here I stress I'm not talking about the SME business. I'm only talking about investment scams, nothing more than that. By the FCA's own admission, in 2020-21, £569 million was lost to financial scams, and that this figure was growing at 23% a year. You don't have to be a mathematical genius to work out that by now it may be not far short of, £1 billion a year. Fear of scams causes risk-averse consumers to hold more cash than might be prudent. They miss out on the returns to be had from good investments, and legitimate financial services firms miss out on a profit opportunity providing services to those people. And also this perception of risk, even with regulated products, drives consumers towards unregulated ones, for example, boiler room scams and crypto. And finally, there is a really big advice gap. Half of all adults with more than £10,000 of investable assets have no access to financial advice. And of course, not all financial advisors are trustworthy. And again, I stress this is not me making these assertions. All of this first part, this is what the FCA is saying. So what are the underlying causes? Well, I think the single biggest one is this. Financial scammers are almost guaranteed to get away with it. There is a willful regulatory underlap. And I'm going to try and describe it now. The first part is that we have some excellent rules in the UK about financial promotions. You can't go around issuing financial promotions unless either your firm or the firm that approved the promotion for you are FCA authorised. It's a criminal offence. Your financial promotions also, even if you're an authorised firm, must not be misleading. If they are, that's also a criminal offence. But the FCA chooses not to prosecute against these financial promotion rules. The FCA instead says, well, we'd rather go after the underlying fraud. If there is a fraud, we'll prosecute for that. But actually, the FCA almost never prosecutes for fraud. In most years, either no prosecutions or one. Then, of course, there is an argument that says, well, that's fair enough. The police surely should be involved in investigating frauds, and it should be the Crown Prosecution Service that then prosecutes. But the problem there is that the FCA has memorandums of understanding with key police services, under which the police refer to the FCA any cases in which there might be an element of financial services regulatory breaches. And of course, what that means is that the police are not in the position of investigating and prosecuting most of these financial services frauds. They're handing them over to the FCA, where they quietly go to die. So the question is, why is this happening? Why is nobody owning the problem of dealing with financial scammers? Until that changes, I think we're going to have a lot of financial scams. The next thing is that the regulatory perimeter is easily exploited, and some people, particularly the FCA, would say it's unclear. Well, there are some cat flaps in the regulatory perimeter. So in the definition of what is and is not regulated activity. The first one is what's known as approved representatives. So an authorised firm can approve some individuals, or indeed firms, that it wants to go out and perhaps sell its services on its behalf. And of course, once it's done that, it can say nothing to do with me, Gov, if things go horribly wrong. The next thing is that an authorised firm can approve promotions, financial promotions, for an unauthorised firm. And again, the same thing, plausible deniability. If the product turns out not to be as described in the prospectus, then the firm that authorised the prospectus will say, well, it's not our fault. We didn't know that those naughty people would go and operate the scheme in a very different way than what we signed off on. And generally speaking, as far as the operation of the FCA is concerned, there is almost total absence of transparency, accountability, and also civil liability. And personally, I think those are the three key areas that need to be worked on. And here is the consequence. This is the Edelman Trust Barometer. And as you can see here, the level of trust of financial services is the lowest of any sector in the UK, with the exception of social media, which is clearly a free-for-all, and of course, which the government, to its credit, is trying to regulate now via the Online Harms Act or bill. So it's a problem. They say it's a problem, but at the moment, it's not clear what's being done about it. And again, I'm going to talk here quite openly about the elephant in the room, and it's one that Andy has mentioned briefly in his slides to date. The root cause is that the FCA is unfit for purpose. And I think there's no point in trying to dilute that message, because there is a risk then of not being taken seriously, of the FCA exploiting that. So you've got to say it's not fit for purpose. At the very best, it is complacent, risk-averse and naive. And at the worst, it's captured by the Treasury, by banks and other big firms. It's opaque and unaccountable to consumer interests. The revolving door spins fast and frequently, and particularly there is a phenomenon that I've identified I call the club, which is that the people who tend to run the FCA are often people who come from the industry, the Treasury, the Bank of England, and the big law firms and professional services firms that serve the city. They're never really outsiders. They're always people who've got some kind of link to stuff that's gone on that probably shouldn't have gone on in the past. So they've got reasons why they wouldn't want to dig too deeply. You know, it's a constraint operating on this organisation. There is no civil liability in the main when things go wrong, as far as the FCA is concerned. In theory, you can sue it if it has acted in bad faith or if your human rights have been breached. In practice, I'm not aware of any successful case brought on either of those grounds, and there are good reasons to believe it's impossible to do so. Maybe actually the single biggest problem for the FCA is that it's culturally defective. And by that, I will kind of refer to the responses to the APPG's call for evidence about that regulator. If you follow the link in my presentation, you'll see there's probably about 25 videos and pieces of written testimony already up on the website. We've had 165 or so in total, so they're just a small cross-section of what's been received. And here are a few of the phenomena that have come out, and these are particularly the observations of current and former FCA employees who we never intended would be part of the consultation, but they actually knocked on the door and said that they wanted to be included, and we worked with them to come up with a question set. So the first is that there's a bias against action at the FCA. The second is that the senior leadership tends to have the FCA line on any particular issue, and people who challenge that line, employees within the organisation who think differently and want to act differently, they are kind of bullied one way or another. We've heard of people being made to go and sit away from their team. We've heard of people being kind of overlooked for promotion, being given poor ratings in their annual appraisal, being overlooked for pay rises and for bonuses, even people being got rid of and then no longer being referred to even by their name, just by their initials. There's also this obsession the FCA has with a certain kind of diversity of identity, but not necessarily diversity of thinking. And the phrase I used is people who look different but think the same. And finally, there's a phrase from my testimony about the FCA, and that is useful idiots led by high-functioning sociopaths. So what I'm saying here is that the staff in the FCA mostly want to do the right thing, and they think that they're doing a good job a lot of the time, but actually in a way they're being abused, they're being misused by the people at the top to make it look as though there is effective regulation when really there isn't, because there are limits to what they're allowed to do. And so those people at the top I call high-functioning sociopaths, and I do believe that the people at the top need to be cleared out in order to fix this. So taken together, I think there is a picture that says the FCA is spectacularly unfit for purpose, and financial fraud will spiral until we deal with this, the elephant in the room. So then that leads you to a big question, which is, do you replace the FCA or try and fix it? Well, there are people who believe that you should replace it, and I respect their view. But I would say to do this would be a huge political battle. It would take years. And actually, we might end up with a Pyrrhic victory. We might end up with what happened in 2012. It would be mostly the same people in the same building, doing mostly the same things with a different sign above the door. And we would have expended so much energy trying to change the organisation to something with a different name that we would then not have the appetite for the battle to say, well, actually, you know, it's really the same people. So I don't think that's the answer myself. Any fix must be genuine, though, and not just cosmetic. One way of achieving that could be to go down the Australian route and have a royal commission. And that would be about getting the full truth out there in an environment in which people who'd done wrong could speak freely, knowing that they would be treated leniently compared to what would happen to them if they continued to keep stum. So that would be a good way forward. It would also be a way of providing redress for the victims and of ensuring that bad actors left the stage. It's a big thing, doesn't often happen, but who knows, this could be a way forward. The second option is a British-style face-saving solution, a bit of a fudge. Maybe that's the pragmatic thing to be asking for. I don't know, perhaps I'm setting my ambitions too low. But again, I stress, for it to work, it's got to be genuine. So let me talk through what I believe is the absolute minimum that will work. And that is really a three-step process. The first one, if you look on the left here, is about leadership and governance change. I would remove the FCA's board, executive committee, and possibly even all the direct reports of those people, and replace them with outsiders. The APPG's call for evidence demonstrates very powerfully why it's about the defective culture. There are two recent pieces of evidence. First is John Swift QC's report about interest rate swap redress, and the second is Walker Sigismund's employment tribunal, and there's a great blog about it I've linked to here. And they have both confirmed long-held suspicions that the FCA dances to the Treasury's tune. And again, removing those people at the top means that you're getting rid of this influence of HM Treasury. Then next thing to do is to create an Australian-style oversight body that represents consumer interests and is continually asking the question, is the FCA delivering for consumers? It's a small step. It's about reputation more than anything else, but it would make a huge difference. And TTF accordingly proposes the creation of what we've called the Financial Regulators Supervisory Council. And there's a link in my presentation to slides about it. Next thing is a duty of care. And this is a duty of care to be owed by authorised persons, normally firms, but individuals as well, to consumers. And the general principle is this: if a firm or an authorised person fails to prevent the causation of reasonably avoidable or foreseeable harm to a consumer, the consumer loses money as a result, that consumer is entitled to be compensated by that firm, and can go to court to obtain this if necessary. And it's really important that it is enforceable by consumers in the civil court and not just by the FCA. Now, those of you who have long memories will know that for more than 20 years, consumer representatives have been arguing for a duty of care to be owed in financial services in the UK, and in the main they've been unsuccessful until last year, when at the last minute in the Lords, some really good peers amended the Financial Services Act 2021 to create an obligation on the FCA to consult about a duty of care and to bring forth rules about it as well. However, the FCA was desperate to prevent this, and it really gamed its legal obligations. Instead of consulting about a duty of care, which I've defined for you, it consulted about a consumer duty, something subtly different. And the consumer duty sounds good on paper, but unfortunately in its standard form, it is not enforceable in the courts by consumers. You've got to sit there and hope that the FCA will enforce it for you. And to be honest with you, based on recent history, you'll be waiting a very long time. And there was a suggestion that it could be accompanied by what's known as a private right of action. Consumers, unsurprisingly, wanted that to be the case. Pretty much every consumer submission to the consultation exercise said it, but the FCA decided no need for it because UK Finance doesn't want it. So we're going to see, I think, next week, the detailed rules will be announced, and I'm pretty sure they will not include a private right of action. I believe that Parliament must insist that there will be one. The third thing is redress for regulatory failure. So the question here is, if the FCA screws up, does not perform its statutory functions as it should, and the consumer loses money as a result, can the consumer be compensated by the FCA? My belief is yes, and it should happen in two ways. First is via the complaint scheme, and the second is civil liability, so you can go to court. And this is really about equalising out the power balance so that the regulator has to act in consumers' interest because it knows there'll be a consequence to not doing so. The FCA is determined to prevent this, and in the July of 2020, it consulted about making its complaint scheme even less useful to consumers, really locking the door on even the slightest remaining possibility that it could provide compensation for regulatory failure. And it keeps delaying proposals, largely because there were 3,000 consumer submissions all saying you've got to do something to improve our rights here, and there are a few industry ones saying no, we'd rather you didn't. So this, I think, is something that needs to be sorted out. I also think that if it happens, there needs to be a waiver of the Limitation Act for the first 6 years so that all of those with legacy cases can sue the FCA without being told they're out of time. There should also be some voluntary method to pay those people quickly so they don't have the expense or the delay of litigation. So here is me making the case for why all of these proposals might work. The first is that a clear out at the top would destroy organizational memory and disorient employees. Now that sounds like I've turned into Dominic Cummings, doesn't it? You know, this kind of throw in the hand grenade and see what happens. And of course, in a functioning organization, you know, trying to destroy organizational memory and disorient the staff is a very stupid thing to do. But actually the FCA is so dysfunctional, I actually believe it's an essential step. You're not going to fix it until you do this. It's crucial that replacements for those removed are outsiders. The club is the problem. A consumer oversight body, and I've talked about a proposal for that, would replace this kind of sotto voce treasury influence with a statutory consumer one. The FCA will say, yes, but we've got a consumer panel. It doesn't count. They appoint the people to the consumer panel. I once applied to join it, and I was told by the recruitment firm, terribly sorry, we've described how the meeting went, the interview went to the FCA, and they say we don't want you because you might criticise the FCA. So actually, it's an organisation that operates within, you know, very severe constraints that prevent it from being effective. A duty of care would recharge the negative externalities of misconduct to firms. You know, if you screw up as a firm, you've got to pay the consequences. It's logical, it should happen. FCA civil liability would do exactly the same thing for it via the medium of the regulator's levy. And firms would no longer be able to dodge misconduct costs by hiding them in regulatory failure. They'd either be paying them via the duty of care, or they'd be paying them via the levy of the FCA if the FCA was picking up the bill. Firms' economic interests for the first time would be aligned with those of consumers in calling for an effective FCA. Payouts for legacy victims are absolutely essential. Of course, you know, I've got a self-interest in saying this because I'm one of the legacy victims. You know, I'm deserving, I believe, significant compensation for what happened in the Connaught case. But actually, there's another reason why I believe that there must be compensation for the past victims of the FCA. It's impossible to fix an organisation while that organisation is still trying to deny its historical failings. And the FCA will keep denying its historical failings all of the time that it thinks that consumers are trying to get compensation for those failings, and the Treasury will not allow it to pay out. So you've got to fix that, I think. Now, this is really next slide about how politicians can make it happen, but it's also about how we, as consumers and voters, can persuade politicians to make it happen, because our job, I think, is to lobby them to do these things. By fortuitous, you know, happenstance, a new Financial Services and Markets Bill is due to be laid before Parliament imminently. The rumours are that it will be spoken about in the Mansion House speech just tonight, and that publication will happen either later today or tomorrow morning. Imminent. Of course, there's a possibility that it may be delayed by changes at the top, who knows. Briefings suggest that there could at last be mandatory redress for authorised push payment fraud. As we know, there's been a voluntary redress scheme for some time, but in the main, it's been ignored by the banks. Solvency II, which is about the kind of balance sheet regulation of insurers, will be replaced with something different, which is a good or bad thing, depending on what that replacement is. Regulators will be obliged to promote the industry. Now, this is clearly a very stupid idea. It takes us back to where things were before the global financial crisis, perhaps even worse. I think if anybody watching this presentation was thinking about how you could improve the trading of the industry, they would say, well, what you could really do is improve consumers' confidence in the industry, so consumers feel much more comfortable interacting with it. So that's about being much more ruthless with the bad apples and improving levels of consumer protection, both about the standard of the regulator, duty of care, and redress if there is regulatory failure. All the things I've described will help the honest majority in the industry. The only people who will be harmed are the bad actors. Okay, so the next thing is that there will be opportunities to amend this act, or this bill as it goes through Parliament. And those are really the three things that I was talking about in the last slide. Those things absolutely can be tacked into this legislation. The other thing which you could consider is an extension of the tribunal system to resolve SME banking complaints, and perhaps also deal with some of the bigger consumer financial services ones, where frankly, we know that the financial ombudsman is struggling with the weight of cases, and it really does find the complex cases very difficult. In fact, quite often it says, we don't feel able to opine on this matter, you've got to take it to court. Court is expensive, tribunal is cheaper, but still gives transparency and hopefully a just result. There are other upcoming legislative opportunities as well. The first is the draft audit reform bill. At the moment, as things stand, it doesn't really amount to a hill of beans. And there's very powerful lobbying that means that it probably never will. But I think if anybody was inclined to amend it, a way they could do it very effectively would be to introduce a duty of care to be owed by auditors to all who rely on their work. And that includes people who invest in collective investment schemes or as shareholders in listed companies. We all rely on the audit being accurate. If it's not, why should we not be entitled to some compensation? If this were to happen, of course, such a regime were to come into place, auditors would be required to insure the risk, and the premiums would depend on their track record, both the firm and the individuals. If you combine that with mandatory price-based tendering, which is something we've been talking about, it would actually price the incompetent and dishonest auditors out of the market, because they would be unable to compete on price for especially the larger and more complex jobs, simply because the risk would be too great for the insurer to cover them at a sensible premium. Next is a Bill of Rights. You probably think that's got nothing to do with financial services. Well, actually, it could be amended to remove the FCA's exemption from civil liability. It's surely against natural justice that a consumer wronged by a big statutory body has no ability to obtain redress from it. Then there's a data reform bill. What's currently planned is a more powerful Information Commissioner's Office, which I think is a vital thing to deal with the FCA, which detests transparency and tries very much to gain information requests and data subject access requests. There's going to be an Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Bill. The idea is to reform Companies House to crack down on scammers. That has to be a good thing. And finally, the Online Safety Bill. The current draft is an obligation on tech platforms to ban ads from unauthorised firms. Some of the people planning to, or who are standing for the leadership of the Conservative Party and therefore to be Prime Minister, would remove some elements of the bill, those that deal with aspects of free speech, for example, but I don't think anybody is proposing to get rid of the bill or to get rid of its provisions about the advertising of financial services, which must be by authorised firms. So what's the alternative to all of this reform that I'm describing? Well, hope, frankly. You could hope the FCA's transformation project actually succeeds. I'm here to say it's never going to happen. And the first reason is this: it's what I call the life cycle of a chief executive of the FCA. One of the great things about having been a campaigner now for at least a decade is that you see these cycles repeating themselves. I've been doing this for longer than anybody has been an economic secretary to the Treasury or has been on the Treasury Committee. So what I've seen is when a new chief executive comes into the FCA, they basically say, well, it's a fair cop, the FCA is broken, I'm going to fix it. There's always a different plan: shoot first, ask questions later. The mission project that Bailey had, the transformation one that Nicolati's got. So the FCA is broken, I'm going to fix it. A couple of years in, it's not really fixed, and the parliamentarians start asking difficult questions. So what he will say is, actually, I could make it a lot better if only you parliamentarians would give me more powers, so blame them. Actually, what then tends to happen is the parliamentarians do give more powers. So then when nothing's happened, things are still going wrong, the FCA chief executive will say, I'm terribly sorry we're unable to do anything here. Events predated our new powers. And then a couple more years, still bad things are happening, and the chief executive is gone. There's a new chief executive, and guess what they'll say? The FCA is broken, I'm going to fix it. The next thing that makes me think the transformation project will not succeed is that it was initially given to Megan Butler to run the thing. She was the person who very heavily criticised in the London Capital and Finance report by Dame Elizabeth Gloucester. She would have been criticised in the one by Raj Parker about Connaught if only he'd had the balls, frankly, to name the FCA executives responsible. And this was rightly criticised by the Treasury Committee, not least because there was not an attempt made to seek external candidates. She left under a cloud. And what happened then was bizarre. Instead of the FCA doing what they were told to do by the Treasury Committee and advertising the job externally, they quietly added it to the duties of their already embattled Executive Director for Authorisations, Emily Shepherd. You know, there were big delays in dealing with authorisations and firms and individuals being authorised that should never be getting through. You'd think that she'd be trying to concentrate on the day job. But no, she's been given transformation as well. A cynic would say this has been done because the last thing that Nikhil Rathi wants is an external candidate applying for the job who would insist on genuinely transforming the organisation. And finally, in every interaction that I and other campaigners have got with the FCA, it continues to delay, deflect, defer and deny with campaigners. See its treatment of freedom of information and DSARS particularly. If the FCA is a good faith actor, these are the two kind of rhetorical questions I would ask of anybody who says the FCA can be trusted to fix itself. If the FCA is a good faith actor, why is it depriving consumers of a duty of care? And if it's competent, why is it scared of civil liability or even of transparency? So my last slide now, just to give you a few conclusions. The next parliamentary session affords many chances to improve consumers' rights in financial services. It's almost a once in a generation opportunity. Fixing the FCA, a duty of care, and making the FCA civilly liable are key priorities. Financial Services and Markets Bill can be amended to do all of these things. There are other bills that can help too, meaningfully. The honest majority in the industry would gain from improving consumer confidence in financial services and finally tackling the FCA. If the FCA means what it says, it will welcome change. If it objects, well, at least there will no longer be any doubt about what we're dealing with. If change doesn't happen and lives continue to be ruined, it'll be politicians' fault for believing the FCA instead of its victims. Okay, that's me done. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. Back to Andy.
I'm sure everybody's going to want to join me in showing our appreciation to Mark for preparing and presenting this session. As always, top-drawer stuff. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. Wonderful. Okay, we've got some time for Q&A and comments, so please just raise your hand either digitally or literally wave it at me if you want to come at this stage. We've got quite a few folks here today, so I'm sure that one or two of you may want to interject with an opinion or two or a question or two. Please raise your hand if you do. If there's nobody, I'll quickly move on. Peter O'Donnell, please share your thoughts. Thank you.
Well, I've been a victim, as has Mr. Bishop. My main area of expertise is looking at taking action against directors of FCA regulated firms once the firm becomes put into liquidation. There is a big gap between, I'll go back a bit. Once a regulated firm is held accountable, not individuals. No individuals have personal liability. Every other profession requires the individual responsible for giving bad advice or making a mistake like cutting off the wrong leg in surgery to take personal as well as collective responsibility, and they don't. When the company goes into insolvency because it's lost its professional indemnity insurance, that's the main reason, the directors are liable for action for what's called misfeasance, the term used in insolvency for when a director deliberately misled a client and profited by that. The problem is the insolvency practitioner world is totally separate from the financial services world, and a bit like the police, there's a memorandum of understanding between the Insolvency Service and the Financial Conduct Authority that they won't deliberately help take action against those directors. And that allows the directors, because they're not personally held responsible, to stay in the industry and start a new firm. We've got the case one, we're trying to restore a firm where the firm stole money by giving advice on pension transfers, got big backhand commissions from the investment company. Then they closed the firm and started a claims management firm and claimed against the system for all of the clients that they screwed. we have a big disparity between financial services and insolvency, and there doesn't appear to be any way of overcoming that. We're helping one insolvency practitioner. We showed that there were £11.2 million worth of claims paid out by the FSCS, and he has taken our advice, engaged a solicitor, and was looked to recover £11.2 million from the directors. We're getting some success, but there needs to be coordination between the two bodies.
Peter, you very often speak about the interconnection between, for example, the City of London Police, the City of London Corporation, the FCA, the FOS, all these interconnected entities. How concerned are you, Peter, that they're all kind of influenced by the same, I'll use a very general phrase, the same kind of dark forces that perpetuate these problems?
Well, I think they definitely are. I found an IP of a firm called Argent Wealth. Richard Rendell is the insolvency practitioner, and I saw that the director of Argent Wealth had formed a replacement company, and the guy had, I think it was about 8 complaints upheld by the Ombudsman Service for misleading people to transfer their pensions into scams. And then the press said there were another 17 had been registered with the FSCS for compensation. I wrote to the insolvency practitioner and said, I hope you're going to take action against the director, because he clearly was misfeasant. In other words, he was allowed to get away with it until he put his company into liquidation, and then he should be held accountable, and there should be civil action against him. And he said, don't be stupid, the guy's a great guy, and I've taken advice and I'm not going to take action. So I put a complaint into the Insolvency Service complaints portal, and it was rejected because they said, well, if the FOS, the FSCS and the FCA haven't taken any action, why should it be our responsibility to speak to the insolvency practitioner and see that he does? That underlines what you've just advised.
Thank you very much. Now, for people who are quite new to this, it may well sound as though the sorts of things I've been saying and Mark's been saying and Peter's just been saying are all kind of like, conspiracy theorist nonsense. I can easily understand why somebody might come to that initial conclusion, but I would just challenge everybody that's thinking that we're exaggerating the problem to just look at the evidence. Look at the evidence available through, for example, the FCA call for evidence by the APPG, and I challenge you to come to any conclusion other than what we've come to. Thank you very much indeed, Peter. Peter, please do feel free to put your details in the chat. People might want to know more about you and what you do. We're going to go to Mr. David Turnbull, then to Pauline Creasy, then to Mark Hambling. Pauline's in San Francisco today, Pauline. Looks very, very nice there. I'm sure the weather's just as nice. I'm only joking. Mr. David Turnbull, please share your thought, and I'm hoping it's about what you're going to say about the Financial Services Complaints Commissioner.
It's not the financial services as such.
John?
I sent you an email the other day that showed an advertising company, FIFO Gold.
Yes.
Now, they posted on their advert that none of the borrowers had defaulted. They were selling ISAs to LCF investors, and investors were getting redeemable bonds. Now, not one of the investors has been able to get redemption on them. I inquired in December of the year when they stopped trading, and no answer. This is getting out of hand. The FIFO Gold should have checked the validity of LCNF before placing that ad.
Yeah.
It's totally incomprehensible.
You make such a great point, David. Like you did this the other day, actually, as well. The phrase regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority has to mean something, doesn't it? It has to mean something. What does it mean? It means regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. So that phrase sets people's expectations that the entity is actually regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. And Pauline might well speak to that point in a moment when she talks about the the matter she's going to raise. Pauline, to you. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Andy, and thanks very much to the presenters, particularly Mark. You know, when you're not feeling great, thank you. Very informative presentation, and also the research that's going on at Birmingham. Very, very interesting. And if I could just deal with that immediately, I was a victim of fraud, like Mark, and it took 4 years to get our money back. And the only reason we got it back was because I and a small group of claimants read the financial law, and we became very resilient. And we got up close and personal with people who didn't want to get up close and personal with us in the Treasury and the FCA. And I would just say a point on that, perhaps for all the research that's still going on, is very few victims, and I don't want to sound patronising, but very few victims could do that. To actually sit down, read the law, understand it, argue with people who perhaps might well know the law a lot better than the victims do. They do absolutely everything to get rid of you, and there is definitely a slippery shoulder syndrome going on with the various government departments who should really be dealing with victims of financial crime, or victims who have just become very distressed about their lives being ruined and turned upside down, and things completely going out of control, and them not being able to see how they can ever get it back on track again. So you have to be very resilient to do that, because you immediately then come up against lawyers who are very experienced practitioners, as Mark and Andy will know well, in actually trying to get rid of you. And they can be extremely unpleasant, and you do have to, you know, have skills. Fortunately, a couple of us, just through our own careers and industry experience, we're able to do that and not be thwarted and put off. But there were even times when we felt like we were almost broken by what they throw at you. I'm absolutely on the side of that. This is all quite deliberate. I think the FCA do dance to the tune of the Treasury and the City. I think the Treasury dance to the tune of the City, and the Treasury makes sure that the FCA do what the Treasury and the City want. Financial Ombudsman Service, I think you wanted me to comment on that. We did try to use that twice, and actually spent a lot of time giving them a lot of evidence, and it went absolutely nowhere. And the first time it was because the former chair of the FCA, Charles Randall, was very keen when he was at meetings with the Treasury Committee on saying the Financial Ombudsman Service is a great form of redress for victims, and this is where victims should go. In our view, this was actually a complete waste of time. It was absolutely useless. First of all, they took all our evidence and then said, because Premier FX, which was the firm that had stolen our money, who were an authorised payment services firm licensed by the UK and Treasury, had stolen our money, they said because the firm had ceased trading, they were actually not allowed to investigate complaints about it, which was a pretty damning comment. Why ask us to send all the information in the first place? Secondly, when we tried again, when we were doing it under the authorised push payment fraud route, which one of the ombudsmen had recommended that we could actually do that on, we put in all our information, and it got held up for 8 months because somebody at FOSS eventually admitted to me that they were waiting for the FCA to have a meeting with FOSS in order to decide whether the Premier FX case, the fraud, could be considered eligible for FOSS consideration. So, you know, FOSS is not independent. It is very much an arm of the FCA. And I think there's a lot of conflict in how FOSS goes about its role, not only because of the number of complaints, but I think they're conflicted by direction that they're getting from the FCA and also the Treasury through the FCA in cases that they don't really want to deal with, or cases that they want pushing aside, you know, pushing under the carpet, into the long grass. We all know these phrases extremely well. So that was, you know, quite hopeless from our point of view. Just a third point, if I may, sorry, very quickly. We talked about redress a couple of times to victims, because that is actually very important. That's the only thing really that puts your life back together again and makes you feel that your campaigning is worthwhile. In my view, this should not come out of public taxpayers' money. I have actually recommended a couple of times to TTF, and we've discussed this, and I've certainly said it to a lot of MPs, my committee have, etc., and the other victims. There should be a fund set up by the city, and it should be funded by the City of London Corporation and the main financial institutions, whereby victims automatically get compensated if they've been defrauded by anyone that is an authorised firm. And if they're not a member of an authorised firm, but it comes into the perimeter, or it should be under financial services regulation, then there should be a process in which victims get reimbursed pretty quickly, within 3 to 6 months, in my view, because the distress that it puts victims if they lose all their life savings or they lose their retirement funds. I had a couple of people who were living in small apartments abroad, having retired, having worked for 40 years, who had to be repatriated, one to the UK and one to Germany, because of what happened to them. And it's just absolutely brutal. People don't really recover from this unless they do get some kind of redress. I think that fund needs to be funded by the city. The money needs to be sitting there. There needs to be 100 million kept there at any one point in time, so that the City of London Corporation doesn't have to go and argue to the financial institutions to put up that money. And every time money is taken out from it, it has to be automatically topped up. It can be done on a pro rata basis. But that would keep the city focused on then trying to deal with scams and fraud in the first place. So I think until you get to the actual core of the problem, that the city institutions, the banks, whomever, various firms, whether they're small, medium or large, they are allowing fraud to take place. They're engaging in fraud because it's lucrative and it's easy to do, because the FCA is not playing its role as enforcer on the scale that it should do. It's highly selective, the FCA, in my view. It nitpicks at the big institutions and ignores all the small and medium players, which is why so much fraud is committed by the smaller players. Our case in point. Finally, if I could just ask Mark, on one of your slides, you had something against Emily Shepherd and a couple of other of your points where it said PARS 231-4. I'm sorry if I missed your explanation, but could you just tell me what that relates to?
Yeah, sorry. So that is, if you follow the link on that presentation, it takes you to the minutes of the Treasury Committee, and it's certain paragraph numbers where you can see that they're really having a go about authorisations being in a state. So I'm just making the point, she's got more than enough to deal with in her day job. Why are they giving her this as well?
I totally, absolutely agree, because if you recall, the reason why the Premier FX fraud was on the scale that it was, which was also a Ponzi scheme and no client designated accounts, was because the head of retail authorisations actually admitted to us that they had not checked them when they had to be reauthorised when Payment Services Directive 2 was coming out in 2018, because, in quotes, they ran out of time because they'd been concentrating on the larger institutions. They made this comment despite the fact that the Treasury Committee had offered them additional resources for the previous 2 years running up to doing this reauthorization process. And there are some quite alarming things, which I've mentioned before, which are being promoted by various industry groups to actually try and speed up the authorizations process, which are extremely dangerous, because that is how Premier FX got away with their scam for so long. So speeding up authorizations is not the solution at all. In fact, you want a more thorough investigation into whether firms are suitable to be authorized in the first place. So that's it from me. Sorry for speaking too long.
Well, don't worry, we're used to it. But you do make such powerful, potent points. I always let it run because you do cover such really good ground. Thank you very much indeed, Pauline. And congratulations, Pauline, once again for the success you had in leading the compensation that your colleague victims managed to get out of the system. It was a real success. Mr. Mark Hambling, over to you, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think most of you know me. I'm involved with the dolphin scam. We managed to get quite a big group together, 2,000 investors at best, although most of them have lost interest now, unfortunately. So interesting. I've spoken to Pauline at length and to Mark in the past. Mark's been at this for what, a decade or more. Pauline spent 4 years. We're just about to start our 4th year on the dolphin issue. And I think that is one of the problems, is that these things take so long to resolve that it's very hard for people to keep their momentum going. And as I say, the majority of the group is, have all gone off to lick their wounds and get on with their lives, which of course is what people do need to do. But nevertheless, we still fight for what we believe is right. I agree with nearly everything that's been said today, and nearly everything that's in the in the report or in the white paper. Obviously, I contributed to a little bit of it, and it's a very impressive document. I think I'm going to condense what I'm going to say and say that one of the problems as I see it, and it's the same for our group, even though we have hundreds of constituents all around the country, we had 150 MPs who were sent our report. The problem is getting parliamentarians interested. You know, I forget now because I'm in Portugal, but I think there's over 600 in that house. And how many did you have? Well, if you count the House of Lords, it's probably over 1,000. How many did you have at your meeting last week? A handful.
Yeah.
That is a problem. That is a fundamental problem. Is most of them don't care, and I don't know how we're going to change that. And that really, to me, is a major problem. All the work is wonderful, but if it doesn't fall on the ears of the people that it needs to get to, nothing will ever happen.
Yeah, you make a sensible point there, Mark.
That's my take on that.
Thank you, Mark. We're going to need to move on if I may.
I mean, I'm not. I'd make it. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
I forgot what else I was going to say now. So anyway, we've reported our issues to everybody, including the FCA, and we're getting the same sorts of response as everybody else. They just cannot say what they're going to do or when they're going to do it, and that is very frustrating. But that's how it is.
It is terribly frustrating. Thank you, Mark. You make a very good point about parliamentarians. We were so pleased with how things went on Thursday, though, because of all the statements of support we've got, and also something that Lord Prem Seeger said. He's going to try to create a debate in the House of Lords directly about the report and the messages in it. So that would be a major achievement. All we can continuously do, Mark, is chip away and build the momentum. We're going to go to Anne-Marie, then we're going to Mark Bishop for any sort of quick comments from Mark before we come back to move on. Anne-Marie Borg, bonjour once again. Your thoughts, please, Anne-Marie. Thank you.
It very much follows what Mark just said. Thank you, Mark Bishop, by the way. It's amazing work you're doing, and I hope you get better very soon. My remark is a slight concern, a big concern actually, which is the general atmosphere at the moment. We're looking at a new Bill of Rights being maybe introduced and changing our constitution. And the substance of that bill will make it much more difficult for people to claim their human rights in the UK. How is that going to impact the work that we're actually trying to do is my concern. And I hope it doesn't too much, but my concern is that it might.
Yeah, I get you. I really do get you. It seems to me there's some real tensions pulling against liberalism and pro-consumer change. There's a problem there. Let's jump back to Mark. I'm sure Mark's got a view to share on that particular matter and anything else you'd like to before we come back to me to move on. Thank you, Emily. Thank you.
So thank you very much indeed, Andy. We're thinking now about the possibility of doing some update to this report or some other report next year. And I just want to kind of plant an idea of a theme that might be worth looking at. And that is, what factors are there that determine which consumers get compensated in one way or another and which ones don't? And I think one of the really big themes, which is the one that Pauline picked up on, is that within the group of people who are victims of that scam, there needs to be a very small core of highly motivated individuals who are prepared to do something about it. If you don't have that, you've got nothing. And I've seen other cases, and I'm not going to mention them specifically, but I can think of one where the number of victims is actually very large indeed, and the amounts of money involved is massive, but where they don't have that. And as a result, I think, what compensation comes to them will be less than they deserve, and lawyers will take big chunks out of it. So I think that's the first thing you need. I think the second thing you ideally need is to find some dirt on the regulator fairly early on, because that gives you leverage. If you can't find any, keep digging, because it's almost certainly there somewhere. And the third thing you need, it helps a lot to have, but you don't have to have, is also a critical mass of numbers. One of the great things about London Capital and Finance was because the average sum invested was quite small, the number of investors was large relative to the amount of money. So you could guarantee that there were several of them in each constituency. So every MP was able to receive casework letters complaining about it. And for that reason, it was far more visible than other cases, and I would say Connaught would be one of them, where actually there were far fewer investors and they tended to be kind of clustered in certain constituencies. So we could never get to every MP. So I think that those are the things that you would ideally have. And if we were able to identify what the success factors were, we could perhaps kind of create almost like a training package, a package that we would go to the victims very early on and say, look, we've been through this. Collectively, we've run various action groups and we've got certain levels of justice achieved. We may be able to help you to do the same. Of course, you can't turn somebody who's unwilling into somebody who's willing, but they may become that themselves if they can see that there is a prospect of success.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. Once again, your input is always just absolutely superb. Okay, I'm going to work my way through a few slides, then we're going to go back to another session to do with the paper in just a moment. Okay, one further statement of support from Kim Ledbetter. She says, by the way, if you don't know, Kim is the sister of Jo Cox, who was murdered. Remember the poor Northern parliamentarian who was murdered? Kim's the sister. The British public need and deserve a financial sector that it has good reason to have trust and confidence in. However, the amount of financial crime, scams and scandals that are taking place shows that there is ample justification to the concerns that many people have, that the regulatory framework is failing to provide sufficient consumer protection. This paper does a first-class job in raising awareness of the terrible plight that victims of financial crime and malpractice face. It is clear that more could and should be done to reduce the chance of people falling prey to criminals and to support them if they unfortunately do. I and many parliamentarians will be keen to help drive through the kind of reforms this paper is talking for. Well done and thank you, Kim Ledbetter MP. Belle Ribeiro Addy, the Labour MP, she says, as a lifelong socialist, I firmly believe in the need for our services and our institutions to serve society as a whole. This includes a financial sector that supports society rather than one that exploits it. My constituents in Streatham, like constituents throughout the country, want to be able to save, invest, bank and borrow safely, knowing that they are dealing with companies that have integrity, companies that are answerable to firm and decisive financial regulators that will take tough action when necessary. I therefore want to see our regulators raising their game when it comes to protecting consumers from harm. The reforms outlined in the TTF paper show exactly how they can do that and how us parliamentarians can help that to happen. And the next one is from Peter Grant MP. It's quite long. There is so much wisdom in this. I am going to take time to read it all through, so bear with me. It's quite long, but it's just so packed with wisdom. And the final point that Peter makes is absolutely excellent. Peter Grant MP, he's an SNP Member of Parliament. Since becoming an MP, I've assisted a number of constituents whose lives have been changed forever by the actions of companies and individuals whose conduct would appall most decent people. I can see echoes of their stories in the cases described in this report. Too often, I've seen the way the system is stacked up in favour of the culprits and against the rights of their victims. Legislation is so weak that even if conduct is morally reprehensible and blatantly dishonest, it might not be criminal. Even if there has been criminal misconduct, the enforcement authorities may lack the resources or willpower to investigate properly. Even if they investigate, it can be very difficult to persuade a jury of lay people to convict beyond reasonable doubt. Even if after conviction the sentences handed down are often far less than would be given for stealing the same amount of money by burglary or other physical theft. Almost any form of enforcement action takes years, during which time the victims remain out of pocket and the culprits are able to carry on in lucrative company directorships. Some scams are set up in such a way that even after they've been proven in court, there's no legal right to compensation for the victims. There is a need for wholesale and urgent reform of the entire regulatory regime, including the Financial Conduct Authority, the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, and Companies House. I commend the work of the TTF in maintaining the pressure on governments to introduce these reforms. I hope the several bills promised in the Queen's speech will be presented to Parliament without further delay, and that they will be sufficiently robust to lift from Britain the shameful, listen to these words, sufficiently robust to lift from Britain the shameful accolade of being one of the best places in the world to set up a fraudulent business. Now, those particular words, ladies and gentlemen, really, really do resonate with me. And they made me think about a TV comedy called The Outlaws. I don't know if you've seen it. It's just basically a program all about a bunch of people who end up doing community service. But there's one particular clip which I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you this clip of The Outlaws because it is remarkably powerful in the way that it actually captures a particular message. If you bear with me, folks, while I find the link I want to show you. I think I found it here. Here we go. I'm just going to paint the picture for you. So here we've got this mainstream TV channel, a bunch of characters, including Stephen Merchant, as you can probably see there, and they're basically talking about carrying out some criminal activity, kind of for a good reason, but that's a side story. The important thing is what Stephen Merchant says about his choice of country to use for setting up a dodgy firm. Listen to what he says.
The cleanest way to wash and transfer this money to the Dean Swiss account is to set up a shell company.
Well, we need an offshore tax haven for that, don't we? Gibraltar or Virgin Islands or something.
You'd think so, but those places have tightened up the rules. We need somewhere that doesn't bother with their due diligence.
Azerbaijan?
Britain. We're one of the best places in the world for fraud. This country really doesn't bother with all that expensive, time-consuming due diligence stuff. So I went on the Companies House website, and for £12 I set up a company. And since 11 AM we've been trading as Laycock Logistical Services. You're welcome.
There we have it, folks. Mainstream comedy talking about, and frankly, ridiculing the fact that our country is the place to go to if what you want to do is carry out harmful and fraudulent activity. It really is. It really is quite shocking. I'm going to move on to our next piece, which is basically starting to bring things to a close, because what we've got to is a very simple conclusion. The TTF, as I said many times before, is an evidence-based organisation. Every claim we are making, we can point to a mountain of evidence to support it. Please understand that. On balance, what does the evidence show? I believe, this is me personally speaking, but I'm sure that many of our members will agree. I believe that the most reasonable, independent, unconflicted, dispassionate and objectively minded people who evaluate the mountain of evidence about the Financial Conduct Authority that we have seen would come to a similar conclusion to me, which is that there is something seriously wrong with the Financial Conduct Authority. I'm going to repeat that. And as you can see, I'm very happy for my name to be directly attributed to that statement. There's something seriously wrong with the FCA. What's wrong with it? It has cultural and leadership issues that run very deep. It's got too many cozy relationships with trade bodies such as UK Finance. UK Finance was referred to in the chat earlier today, and the sector's big beasts such as the banks. It is conflicted. It is captured by the industry it is supposed to regulate. It's confused about its purpose and priorities. There's a woeful lack of transparency, truthfulness and trustworthiness about the way that the FCA works. There's a woeful lack of oversight and accountability. Those to whom it is accountable are too soft on it because there are conflicts of interest. It doesn't always act in good faith. It isn't always honest. When it makes serious mistakes, it tries to cover them up. We know this. We've seen the evidence. We've seen the proof of that, the hard proof of that. It has exploited and abused vulnerable whistleblowers. It has put them in harm's way to protect its own interests. It acts immorally too often. For example, it has shown itself to be morally bankrupt over the John Swift QC review of interest rate hedging product mis-selling by banks. I'm going to briefly explain that last point. You need to know this. So long story short, the banks have been shown to have been acting badly in selling toxic interest rate hedging products. The government tried to get the FCA to do what it needs to do about that. The FCA spent £6-7 million on a review about what should be done. The reviewer, John Swift QC, said the FCA should make the banks pay compensation to the people it's harmed. The FCA have literally effectively said, no, we're not going to do it and you can't make us. Thank goodness for the all-party parliamentary group on fair business banking led by Kevin Hollinrake MP, because they're not tolerating that. They are in the process of taking the FCA to court. So isn't this crazy, folks? We've got our elected representatives in the House of Commons and peers in the House of Lords who are working hard to take the Financial Conduct Authority to court to make the banks pay compensation to people that the banks have ripped off and caused untold harm to. What a tragic, tragic situation. It really is awful. Unfortunately, the real underlying root causes of the problems with the FCA are to do with the ecosystemic issues and tensions brought about by the decay in the quality of democracy that has been taking place in recent decades. This is an issue that goes back decades and decades. Please do make sure you find yourself with time to watch what I'm about to show you. You can't watch it now, but do give yourself a treat for 30, 35 minutes and watch this particular episode of Yes, Prime Minister. It's the episode called A Conflict of Interest. It came out on December the 31st, 1987. You can find this in various places, but you can also find it completely free to watch through the link at the bottom of this page, dailymotion.com link. So you can watch this, you can all watch it. Now, remarkably, the notes in the middle, you might be able to see this, it describes what the episode's all about. It says, Prime Minister Hacker, pressured by rumours of wrongdoing in the city, is tricked by Sir Humphrey into appointing a less than honest man as the new governor of the Bank of England. And that, for me, is quite remarkable, folks. I'm making the point that these issues were known about decades ago. It's impossible for there to have been genuine attempts to fix these issues over the last 30, 40 years if the attempts to fix it had been genuine. The problems would have been fixed by now. The fact that they haven't been fixed is yet more proof, as far as I'm concerned, that there really hasn't been genuine attempts to fix it, because the whole system is interconnected and interwoven with interdependencies that basically mean those with the power want things to remain pretty much as they are. Okay, we've pretty much covered our formal presentation. This has been great. I want to thank once again Robert and Mark in particular. We're going to go to Q&A mode, and we're going to spend the next 15 minutes or so, if you wish, talking about other related matters that you folks would like to raise. So hands up, wave them at me, or otherwise, if you would like to. We're going to go to Mr. Paul Birch, who I have the pleasure of interacting with on an almost daily basis. Paul, why don't you take the time to take yourself off mute, introduce yourself, tell everybody where you are, why you're involved with what we're doing, just briefly though, Paul, and then get to your point. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My beef is likewise the totally immoral way in which the UK establishment deals with financial crimes. My background is that I retired, took out a Cure Ops, which is a pension available to expat Brits and or indeed overseas people who have worked and earned a pension in the UK who have moved overseas. The Cure Ops provider that I used was a subsidiary company of a UK FCA regulated pension provider. The Cure Ops was based in Malta, and the policy that I was sold was lodged with Friends Provident International in the Isle of Man, which again is a subsidiary of an FCA regulated insurer. And long story short, the whole thing went belly up, and I have lost hundreds of thousands of pounds at the hands of a fraudster IFA, who subsequently, after my efforts, was suspended by his not regulator, but his industry body, the CII, for repeated misuse of their intellectual property. When he was suspended in March 2018, the suspension notice that appeared on the CII website confirmed that because the IFA had also fraudulently claimed he was FSA/FCA regulated, they had shared that information with the FCA. That in itself, you would think, would be the catalyst for the FCA to act upon the various memoranda of understanding which exist between all the other regulators involved in the jurisdictions, i.e. Malta, the UK, and the Isle of Man. Unfortunately, since then, and despite efforts by my UK lawyers, my local MP, Rob Roberts, who is also on the APPG group, to liaise and engage with the FCCA, or the FCA rather, no progress has been made whatsoever. And the frustrations are overwhelming, because the problem is, and everybody's alluded to it, that there is either deliberately or inadvertently absolutely no attempt by the establishment regulatory bodies to liaise with each other, whether that be in the UK or in Malta or in the Isle of Man. And as an instance, and I know we've all got Andrew Bailey in our sights because he has overseen the absolutely abysmal record of the FCA when he was in charge there. And I'll quote from a memorandum of understanding for supervisory cooperation between the Malta Financial Services Authority and the Bank of England and the Financial Conduct Authority. This was signed in March of 2019, and on the final page of that agreement, it is note, and I quote from this document, signed for the Bank of England, Sam Woods, Deputy Governor, Prudential Regulation, Bank of England, for and on behalf of the Bank of England, including in its capacity, excuse me, as the Prudential Regulatory Authority, and also countersigned for the Financial Conduct Authority, Andrew Bailey, Chief Executive. Now, this was in March of 2019, and lo and behold, as we reward for the abysmal job that Andrew Bailey had managed to do at the FCA, in December of 2019, he was appointed as the new Chief Executive of the Bank of England. It just staggers belief. And just one other thing that I would like to bring to the party, which again demonstrates the totally disparate actions of the various regulators. By definition, every single member of a CureOps pension is registered with HMRC. That is a given. I and my MP have complained to the to HMRC asking why they continue to register or not delist CureOps who have found to be in breach of all these financial irregularities. Again, it's nothing to do with them. They say it's a regulatory matter, it's this, it's that. It is frustrating beyond belief that whoever you turn to, they all say it's nothing to do with us, it's this, it's that, it's the other. It cannot carry on, because there are innocent victims who not only have been financially raped, and I use the word advisedly, by those involved, but the knock-on effects of poor health and the stress that it causes is just unbelievable. and it's not acceptable.
Well, thank you very much indeed for stepping forward and sharing those thoughts. I agree with every word you've expressed there. I really do. And please do keep up the fight. You're doing a great job, a really great job holding the authorities in Malta to account, and those who should be holding the authorities in Malta to account. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Who'd like to go
Thank
next?
you.
Who'd like to go next? I've got a few more slides to wrap up with before. Okay, I'm going to move on then. I'm going to move on. So let me share my screen and get back to the slides. Okay, some further food for thought. And this really is just to kind of bring everything to a conclusion, really, folks, and wrap things up. So Margaret Mead, I think all of you, if you've been with TTEC a while, you've heard me talk about this quotation on numerous occasions. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. That really describes the ethos of the Transparency Task Force. That describes what we're all about. We're only a small group of people, but we're determined to make things better. The next one is from James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And we make really good use of that in the last section of the report. We basically say that progress begins with realism. Progress begins with realism. What does that mean? It basically means you've got to have the guts to look at the reality of the situation, to recognize how bad the situation is before you can start fixing it and making it right. And that's what we're doing. We understand that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And you tell me any other organisation in the UK that is doing the kind of work we're doing to the level we're doing it. We really are quite proud of the work that we're doing because we are having the guts to actually look at the reality of the situation. This is Justice Louis Brandeis. He wrote the book in 1914 that led to the phrase, sunlight is the best disinfectant. These are his actual words. I built the Transparency Task Force around this man's wisdom. Publicity is justly commended as a remedy for social and industrial diseases. Sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants, electric light the most efficient policeman. Our strategy, and some of you have heard this before, our strategy is to parade the problem. The level of criminality and unprofessionalism in the financial industry, I describe it as a festering sore on the face of the financial sector, sometimes even as an ugly festering sore on the financial sector's face. And I use that very evocative, powerful language because I want to embarrass the industry and the politicians into taking action. And that's what they need to do. That's what we mean by parading the problem, making everybody look at it. That's what the report is all about. Nothing in this world, says Calvin Coolidge, nothing in this world can take the place of persistence. Talent will not. Nothing is more common than unsuccessful men with talent. Genius will not. Unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. Education will not. The world is full of educated derelicts. Persistence and determination alone are omnipotent. Pauline Creasy is a wonderful example of this. Her success with Premier Effects was all about persistence and determination. It's a model we can all follow. Many other campaigners have followed a similar path. People like Sue Flood, people like Mark Bishop, etc., etc., etc. The slogan "Press On" has solved and always will solve the problems of the human race. Calvin Coolidge. That's a message to all of us to keep at it. We mustn't give up. Here's Martin Luther King. If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. You have to keep moving forward. And that's our message to ourselves and to each other. We have to keep moving forward. Let's continue to dream up all the possible ways that we can to embarrass the authorities into taking action, whether that be research papers like the report we're presenting today, whether that be the Rally for Better Financial Regulation, whether that be the events that we run to galvanise support for the kind of positive, progressive and purposeful reform that we need, whether that's our efforts to get into the Times or the Independent or the Telegraph or on the TV or on Radio 4 or Panorama. All the different things we're doing are the different ways we've dreamt up to keep moving forward. I believe we've moved forward again today because today we've got the benefit of understanding the power of that particular research document. Faces of financial crime, suffering caused by the financial sector. Thank you very much indeed for being with me today, everybody. Why don't we take a moment to salute ourselves and applaud ourselves for being part of this session to help drive change. Thank you all very, very much indeed. Okay, folks, we'll wrap it up there. This is the last TTF event before the recess. The next program of events will be up and about in September. Of course, those of you that know, we have a bunch of other minor meetings today. There's one at 2 o'clock, for example, on this very same link, if you want to join it, but we'll sign out there. Thank you all for coming with us on this journey today. Once again, big thanks to Mark Bishop, Robert and Kerry, and all the others involved with the report. Cheers, folks. Cheerio. Bye-bye.